Good morning, everybody. Today is the third day of our conference on sustainability and integral or civilization, contemplative civilization. And today we will begin with a panel around a book. So part of the intention was, because this is the 150th year anniversary celebration of Sri Aurobindo, to look at some of the more recent works that have been produced around him. And we are considering 4 books during this conference. And 2 of them are about Auroville. We will look at one of them today and then one tomorrow. And 2 of them are about Sri Aurobindo. And it's interesting that the 2 books on Sri Aurobindo have the same name. It's called Reading Sri Aurobindo. And it's interesting that this has come about in the 150th year because there is felt a need to make Sri Aurobindo more approachable. It's really a question of how to build the bridge between our times, our reading habits, and Sri Aurobindo's voluminous literature. So the 2 books are quite different. They're called the same, but today we are going to discuss Reading Sri Aurobindo that has been edited by Devdip Ganguly and Gautam Chikramane. Gautam is not with us here today. Maybe he's on the Zoom. And Devdip is here with us. Devdip Ganguly is a faculty of the higher education wing, which is called Knowledge, of the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. And he's also pursuing a graduate degree in Asian Contemplative and Transcultural Studies here at CIIS. So we're very happy to have him here in San Francisco with us to have this live discussion about this book. And we will get to know a little bit more about this book. With me, I have Vladimir Yatsenko, who is another great scholar of Sri Aurobindo's works, has been studying Sri Aurobindo for a long time in the beginning, initially under very difficult conditions in Ukraine, part of the undivided USSR at that time. And for many years, a resident of Auroville, and now connected with the Sri Aurobindo Learning Center in Greensville. Yes, not South Carolina. So with that, I'll turn it over to Devdip to tell us a little bit more about the book, his intentions in editing this book, what went into it, and we can follow that up with some conversation around the book and open it up to questions with the audience. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for being here, and for also those of you who have joined us online. So this project was initiated during the pandemic, and my co-editor Gautam Chikramane, who lives in Delhi, he works in a think tank in Delhi. He's the vice president of the Observer Research Foundation, which is India's largest, most significant think tank in the field of policy and economic research and so on. So very different field of work. However, somebody who has also engaged with Sri Aurobindo's writings over the years. So he had the idea of, how do we introduce and bring the writings of Sri Aurobindo to a larger audience in a way that is not too simplistic, nor is it too academic, something that really appeals to a broad spectrum of people. So we got together and started working on this project. Now, for those of you who may not know, Sri Aurobindo has 36 volumes in his complete works. And he has covered a very vast spectrum of subjects. He starts with his early writings during the revolutionary period, and then later on when he comes to Pondicherry, when Sri Aurobindo moves to Pondicherry in 1910, soon after, in 3-4 years, he starts writing in a journal called the Arya, where he brings out most of his major works, and he writes on integral yoga, commentaries on the Vedas, on the Upanishads. He has essays on social and political philosophy. And so there's really a large ground that he covers. And then subsequently, after he stops publishing the Arya, he continues corresponding with disciples, hundreds, literally hundreds of thousands of letters over the years. And then again, later on, he has poetry that he continues to write and work on. Of course, his magnum opus, Savitri. So if you put all this together, it comes to more than 20,000 pages. And I think 6 million words is what they told me at the archives. So it's a lot of material, which we feel really is extremely important. In a sense, one of his most important legacies. And so, though there is a lot of interest and engagement with Sri Aurobindo around the world, I think it is far below what we feel should happen, because the ideas and the perspectives that he puts forth in his writings contain really important perspectives with regard to dealing with the challenges that we face today across different areas of work and being. So the intention behind the book was to not to summarize the 36 volumes, but more to introduce these different books through the perspectives of different readers. So initially, Gautam planned to write the book, and then he roped me in, and then we thought, okay, let's write the book together. But I quickly told him, I said, we cannot cover 36 volumes in a fashion that is, adequate. So we need to get other people who have engaged with these works over many years. And so we also wanted a very diverse group of people. We didn't just want, devotees living in Pondicherry or scholars who engage with Sri Aurobindo. We said we have to have a kind of all the different kinds of people who are working with the writings of Sri Aurobindo. So we have people from India, people who live internationally, academics, practitioners. We were very particular about having as many women writers as possible. And so we really reached out, and we also have young writers in their 20s. I think the youngest one is 26 or 27, Anshul Sinha. And then we have people in their 70s and 80s also who have contributed essays. So about 1/3 of the book is written by Gautam and me, and the rest are these contributors who have pitched in. Among them are editors who worked on the complete works of Sri Aurobindo, such as Richard Hartz and Peter Hees and Matthias. They were all people who spent many years with these texts. So what happens through this book is that we assigned volumes that they were familiar or comfortable with, and as a result, each essay is a reading. We call it reading by so and so. So it's a reading of that work from the perspective of an author or a person who is engaged with that text. And we also gave some guidelines. We said each essay, each chapter should not be, more than 3,000 words. So not too long, not too short. And we insisted on having a certain number of extracts from the volumes, 5 extracts roughly of 100 words each, so that those who are reading this can get a feel for the style. Because Sri Aurobindo has very different styles of writing. If you read his early works, he's appealing to this sense of the revolution against the British. If you see his later works, if you read the Life Divine, it's profoundly metaphysical and philosophical, though he says he's not a philosopher, but he really writes incredibly well in that genre as well. If you read his letters on yoga, they're much more praxis based, and so there is a kind of a certain kind of directness with which he addresses the problems that the practitioners of the yoga are having. So there are many different styles, and what this book aims to do is, the question that we get a lot is, which book of Sri Aurobindo should I start reading? Or some people say, he's so difficult, we can't read him, it's so difficult. I keep hearing this, and like, you probably haven't found the book that works for you. And what this does is it gives the opportunity to people to get a feel for what is available across his different volumes, and then choose what they would like to start with or explore further. Many people, have read a lot, but maybe not everything. And so it's a kind of a primer, a guide. I would say that our goal would be accomplished if it leads the reader to actually pick up a book or a work by Sri Aurobindo and start reading it. That's really what we would like. Just engage with these ideas in your own way. And so this was released a year ago, and we were also lucky to have a good publisher. So Penguin Random House, Millie Aishwarya, I just want to mention her. She has she's one of the very important persons in the publishing space in India, and she took it up. And thanks to their outreach and their sort of global network, it was available. It is available around the world, and the response has been very positive. We every week or every fortnight, we get messages or emails saying, "Oh, thank you. The Amazon algorithm recommended this book to us, and we had no idea that Sri Aurobindo had such a diverse set of writings, and now we are reading such and such volume, or we are exploring this, or I'm carrying Savitri with me everywhere." And it's interesting for us to see that positive reaction. So I don't want to talk maybe too much. It will be nice to have a conversation around it. Maybe also we can also have a conversation around not just the book, but the larger, the topic that it addresses, the reading of Sri Aurobindo and the topics. So I'm going to open it out to Vladimir and Debashish, and then we can get back.
Thank you, Devdip. Is it okay? Yeah, is this fine? No, I think there's no sound here. Yeah, it works? Okay, great, thanks. Yes, Devdip. So one of the things that I was wanting to ask you is that I think, yes, as you mentioned, you all gave guidelines to the writers, the contributors. And I appreciated the fact that one of the guidelines you gave is that the essay should not be about the work. In other words, don't try to paraphrase what Sri Aurobindo is saying or try to explain what he's saying, but more contextual. Try to give the background, or try to give an approach to, build the sort of circumstances, or build the bridge with which people can approach Sri Aurobindo. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to that, I just want to say that we also asked the writers not to speak about their personal experiences. A lot of the writers are also practitioners. They have I'm sure they have a lot of beautiful things that they could have written about, which would have made it personal. But this is not the book for that. We really wanted them to have this perspective that you're writing for the world at large. And so don't try and digest Sri Aurobindo and sort of give it in a fashion where it's already chewed, but just something that puts you into the atmosphere, in contact with the atmosphere of the book. So I believe that, all books, but especially Sri Aurobindo's books, they contain something of the atmosphere of the person who wrote them. And in Sri Aurobindo's case, because he wrote with this tremendous concentration and consciousness that pours into these words, holding these books is really coming into contact with that consciousness. And so I feel that we have to be very careful not to dilute that and not to put ourselves in between that. And yet, at the same time, we are trying to write about them, and we are kind of bridging casual interest or curiosity to the works. So it's a subtle
Sure.
interplay, which I think our writers I feel that most of our writers have really done a good job. And I just want to also say that Professor Banerjee has got two really good chapters in the book. We specifically asked him to write about the Isha Upanishad, which is, you know, one of the foundational Vedantic texts, especially for Sri Aurobindo. And Professor Banerjee has written a book already before Reading Sri Aurobindo came out. He had published a very significant commentary on the Isha Upanishad based on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. So we have people, you know, we have people who really know those texts well. And I think you also wrote on the synthesis of yoga. Another person who I want to mention is Richard Hartz, who lives at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry for many years, an editor of the complete works, and somebody who has a incredible grasp of the writings. And he again took all the chapters that we were not able to find people for sometimes. Like some of the volumes are so new, they've literally come out in 2019, 2020. So people haven't even had time to read them. And why they are new is because these are typically the volumes that deal with the letters which have been found over the last few decades, and they have not. Some of them have not been published before, and so those volumes were ones which Richard was able to do really well, as also the translations and so on. Yeah.
Vladimir?
Yes, right. Yeah, this was actually a difficult task to do what he said. I actually couldn't manage it myself. He asked me also to write few articles. And since I'm so subjective with Sri Aurobindo's reading, I struggled how to make it objective and I couldn't manage it. So I had to give up. I'm just telling you something interesting psychologically, because it has such an impact on you that you don't know how to approach it objectively. There is no objective knowledge there in a way. So you have to be very, I don't know, very sincere in a way. It was a challenge.
Yeah, I know, I get what you're saying. And I think it requires a certain stepping back into a kind of impersonal, detached witness consciousness, and where you say, okay, here is a material where without bringing in my experience, how do I still relate what it means to be? So it is a challenging thing. I totally get that.
And hymns to the mystic fire, how can you really describe? Or I know Vedic, the new volume which came up with Vedic interpretations. It's an incredible from archives. So much information, so much knowledge which is unpacked. Nobody reads those, archival notes. It's an amazing source of knowledge for those who study the Vedas. So not to be impressed, it's quite a challenge, or to be impressed in an objective way is hardly possible for me. For some people, they manage somehow.
So I think one way in which I approached it, exactly what you're saying, is I think that the guideline about approaching context was helpful to me, so that I could step out of the text almost completely and put myself in the minds of the present day audience and what is their space of readership, right? In other words, that's something that academics do. In other words, academics are conducting a conversation with existing knowledge. So what is the existing understanding of this subject? That becomes one of the things that you put yourself into to then build a bridge with that. How do those ideas, because I think one of the problems, because it comes back to this issue of why isn't Sri Aurobindo read that much today? See, so, I mean, in fact, during his lifetime, he was read a lot more. I mean, right from the time that the Arya was written, he had a strong impact on word thought, on important minds of his time.
Of the age, yes.
But there was a gradual falling off. I mean, we even have Robert McDermott here, who belongs to, he bridges that time period and was present during the early years of CIIS, when people like Haridas Chaudhary and Frederick Spiegelberg and Robert himself were editing journals and carrying out conferences, in which others like J.N. Mohanty and Professor Chubb and a lot of other people were actually engaging with Sri Aurobindo's ideas. But it fell off from the map somehow. And we have to ask the question, why did that happen? Why did he become unimportant or uninteresting? Or was it just that nobody was conducting any studies into him? So I wonder, that's a question.
It's a beautiful question, actually. Very difficult to answer, but there are maybe two reasons. We can see that Radhakrishnan already misunderstands Sri Aurobindo. He says, Sri Aurobindo speaks about the luminous beginnings, but we believe in progress. Yeah, that's how he misunderstood Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the beginnings, of the Vedic beginnings. So he didn't look deeper. So to say, that mind cannot really see where Sri Aurobindo is driving. It's one thing. So everything fell into Advaitic mindset because it was much more established in the world, and Buddhism and everything supported that idea. And it was much more spread. Sri Aurobindo is not spread. And he didn't want to be spread. He didn't want to be, popularized. It's not a popular language. It's most probably not for everyone even. Maybe it's for certain people who look for this integrity or some integral knowledge, which is already a requirement of some kind of, so this is...
I agree with you, Vladimir. And, so I have that's a very interesting point that you bring up, and I have a few different thoughts around it. So for one, Sri Aurobindo was actually publishing a journal which went out around the world for 6 to 7 years. So clearly there is an intent to put down these thoughts, these his whatever he's developing, and to have it there. And if you read one of the essays that he writes, which there is one called the Arya's Fourth Year, there is one. So at the end of every year of publication, there would be a kind of little looking back and looking forward kind of article. And those are really interesting because you kind of get a glimpse into why he is doing this. And so clearly there was this intention that this has to manifest. And I have come across different views in our community. So some people, for example, will say, oh, this was important then, but you don't need, maybe it's not important now. Now you have to practice the yoga and you don't have to read so much or engage with the text so much. There's another view, which is that somehow as if the mind is not so important in the yoga, you have to go much more with the heart and the psychic being and so on. So I have come across these perspectives and I respect them. But I also think two things. I think that one, I feel that his writings are not only relevant, but they are really essential in the modern context, because even if the language is difficult, I feel that, as I said earlier, they contain answers to very fundamental questions that we are grappling with today. And the second thing about this, the heart and mind, paradigm, which maybe both of you can also, weigh in on, I feel that we know that the mind has its limitations, its challenges. It can be an obstacle to spiritual progress and growth. But I also feel that it can be a tremendous aid and a help. And certainly in a yoga which is integral, there is an important development of the mind which needs to happen. And there's no better person to help you do that than Sri Aurobindo himself through his works. And in the ashram, when you look at the 1940s, 50s, even up to the 60s and 70s, there is so much engagement with the writing happening. Magazines are coming. There is no, proletizing. That should never be the approach. Sri Aurobindo is not. I mean, he never cared about being read by a large number of people, or that he was not interested that many people join in the yoga or the ashram. He was always very reserved in that respect, very selective, very reserved. And I feel our role as academics, as scholar practitioners, is to make this available for whoever is open or interested in engaging with it.
Very nice.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at that time, if you look at Sri Aurobindo's own writings, if you see the introduction to the synthesis of yoga, for example, he clearly sees that this is a time that needs, you know, the yoga must be given to mankind now, because there's something going on that there's a sort of sense of history to it. And that's, I think, an important aspect of all his works that that this book brings out to some extent, that we can sort of look at Sri Aurobindo in an ahistorical way, as somebody who is an eternal thinker, which is also true. But there is a very strong historical aspect to it, that he's conscious of his place in history and his intervention in history, that this needs to be given to mankind now. Not, again, as you said, not in a kind of a way in which we are trying to persuade people, but in a way in which people know that this knowledge exists. So, and then if you look at some of the people who are receiving it at that time, there's a very interesting Danish who visits early years, between 1914 and 1920, after the mother and Paul Richard first got there. It's Johannes Hollenberg. And so some of these writings are now coming out. Hollenberg's diaries, for example, his description of his meeting Sri Aurobindo, and then going back to Denmark. He had to go back because of the war. In a way, they thought he was a spy of some kind, and he went back to Denmark. And actually, because you know, I think later during the Second World War, he escaped to it, because there was German infiltration. So he escaped to an island. But he was writing at that time. And you can see even in his description of meeting Sri Aurobindo, that it's something stupendously historical that is going on. Knowledge is being given times. And then he writes books on yoga. And his understanding of the kind of yoga Sri Aurobindo is talking about, not as a kind of, you know, world negating project, nor as something that is done in seclusion, but as a enterprise that can change the way we, like what we're talking about, contemplative civilization, that is the project, and a different kind of civilization. That if we don't, I mean, I think the urgency of that is that he seems to feel if we don't go there, there are very strong anti-forces that might destroy civilization. And actually we see to some extent the truth of happening.
Yeah. And there is something interesting to look at this from the point of view of historical perspective, as you said, that Sri Aurobindo is on all scriptures, Rig Veda, Upanishads, Gita, Savitri, all these are the major. And why does he do that? And it's a big question. It's not only to kind of indulge or to know to have the material ready for discussion, but I think that connection, finding that aim from the beginning, which was there in the Indian civilization and which has to be highlighted now and brought forward, creates that, you know, consciousness of historical depth and power. So Sri Aurobindo is not some innovative thinker who, you know, fancied his own idea and now offers us. No, he back at all his writings are based on that. He wants to connect us. And this historical perspective is so important. Yes.
Yeah, I also think about the fact that some of the early publications that were done internationally were actually in the States, in America. I believe in the early 50s, there was the editions that came out from New York. And also
Sri Aurobindo Library, I think.
Yes. And in the same vein, when you were mentioning about, people coming to the ashram, I'm also remembering, I think it was Nishtha, Woodrow Wilson's daughter, who came across the original texts in a library in New York, if I'm not mistaken. And then it was the essays on the Gita, if I don't remember, I think somebody's on that. But I think she read the Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita and then wrote to him and then eventually moved to the ashram. So she lived there till her passing. And so it's I have come across so many stories of people who just coming across the text and reading it changes their lives or gives them an approach or a perspective. And there is an urgency to it. Also, I feel like there is a repeating cycle. Like we find ourselves today in the early years of the 21st century, a bit where we were in the early decades of the 20th. And I think many of the problems that he was addressing, especially in his socio-political texts, are challenges that we are facing very much today.
I wanted to also draw attention to something that both of you brought up. I think which is Vladimir talked about how difficult it is to be objective. And of course, that can be said about anything, but particularly Sri Aurobindo's works. And I think you brought it up by talking about the aura of consciousness of the works. So this is something, and talking about what distances people from the work today, I'd say that there are habits of modernity that also play their part into it, and that need changing, that need addressing, you see. So I would call this fact that you're talking about the darshanic quality of the work. This is already a kind of problematic thing to talk about with regard to modern readership. Almost as if the book is Sri Aurobindo for me. So in that sense, it's like Frederick Spiegelberg's darshan of Sri Aurobindo that he writes about. I would say my first reading of Sri Aurobindo was almost like that. You see? Now, I couldn't say this to an academic, audience, but it's true. And I think to address that, Sri Aurobindo has himself given us the first steps, because he's talking about a new theory of language. He's talking about a mantric theory of language. We could call it a darshanic theory of language. So I think an introduction to these revolutionary ideas of, I'd say post-secular age, that what he's calling the subjective age that he's inaugurating, as well. And perhaps this is a way of introducing that, rather than keeping it behind and saying, oh, just read him for his content. You can't just read him for his content.
It's quite interesting, because I had a friend with whom I studied in St. Petersburg University, and he was a philosopher. He was actually a champion of Hegel and Marx. Who can read Marx? God, it's kind of heavy reading, And he couldn't read one page of Life Divine. He said his brain is boiling. He could not make sense. So there is something, but absolutely right. It is Sri Aurobindo in the words. And by the way, for me, Sri Aurobindo is this. Sri Aurobindo is not some, personality or somebody who, like guru, you have to worship. It is what he brought to us. His weight is in the books. You just open the book, read one page, and you feel the presence of the master. It is really contagious in a way.
That's a really interesting point. And in my experience, I come across people who clearly have no difficulty with English. I mean, they may even be professors and but they find it very challenging. They say, "Oh, I'm not able to, approach Sri Aurobindo or read his texts or make much sense of it. It's not speaking to me." And I come across people for whom English is clearly a second language, who may not have so much experience in reading philosophical texts or whatever, and they say, "Oh my God, I can't stop. I am just continuing to read and continuing to read." And this is also interesting because I feel like every book or teaching or knowledge has its time for each person. And a book, and this happens again with all books, but especially in books which are infused with consciousness. You pick up a book and you read it and you say, "Oh, it's not so interesting," and you put it back. And then maybe after 3 years or 5 years, you pick it up again and you're like, "Oh, this is incredible. How did I not, resonate with this earlier?" And I think that happens a lot with Sri Aurobindo's books as well.
Yeah, as well as you read something, you get something out of it, and you pick it up after some time. You wonder whether you ever read it. It looks totally new.
Yes.
But I'd like to go back a little bit more to this idea. I mean, on the one hand, we could talk about the natural receptivity of people, that some people find it easier and some people are. You're talking about the difficulty of understanding, but there's also the difficulty of the sense of something in the words that is very powerful. And there is a kind of in the modern mind, there is a kind of a rejection of that. You see, there is a sense that, oh, this is somebody who is acting as if he knows everything. You see, so there is the power of knowledge to it. So I think the mother has pointed out that the best way to reach Sri Aurobindo is to read him with a quiet mind, to read him with a silent mind, if possible. And the interesting aspect of that is that she says that it builds new brain cells. Actually, that's how she says. I mean, brain connections or formations of consciousness, in certain inner formations of consciousness that form the receptivity to receive this kind of text. I think, the future poetry by Sri Aurobindo gives us that sort of approach to reading that prepares us for the higher word, for the vak, the Pashyanti Vak, as he says, the intuitive seeing word that this work embodies. And it's important to bring that into public discourse. That what does that mean? And I think he's trying, that's part of his project. Part of his project is a theory of language, which is not common.
That's why most probably he worked with the Veda so much. That language is actually knowledge. And it's difficult to believe so, because we are so educated in our Western paradigm, and we know the readers, logocentrism and so on. We think that word is actually not a real thing. It's a kind of imitator or some kind of pretender to the truth. It's a shadow. But in this case, it's a different word. And I'm very glad that you are highlighting this linguistic aspect. He learned it, I think, from the Veda. And actually, he speaks about this. He says that he couldn't understand the Veda much, and looked at it as something, historical value and so on. And then later he understood Upanishads, but he couldn't find the language. Notice, he said this. Experiences. It was not enough in the Upanishads, is a grand literature, or Gita. Why not from there? It is already closer to our rational, to our mental structure, but there in the Veda, he found the language which is matching with knowledge. And that he took. And you can see in Savitri, it's full of Vedic imagery. And I had the whole privilege to work on this. And maybe one day we'll publish this Vedic imagery in Sri Aurobindo Savitri. Because if you read it from the Vedic perspective, you will see how much is there that vision. Those images are powers. It's not only what he says, it's also what words he is using, what images. These images are very powerful and very important. They deal to say the impressive remember, recognize in a deeper self. We all have that knowledge, but it is veiled, it is buried, and we have to bring it forward. And he does it for us, and we recognize it. Sometimes even you read Savitri and you see next passage, oh, it is totally anticipated by something in you, as if you recognize that it must be this line. It's amazing. It's like something magical. Anyway.
Yeah, that's really very beautiful. I don't know if you would like to continue something on that point, or I have something I want to go back to.
Yes, please.
I just want to highlight that another thing which really impresses me is that when he was living in Pondicherry, so he moved in 1910 and he was there till his passing. And for 16 years that he was, in public, so to say, it was not as if he was going out much or engaging with the world in any way, but he kept in touch with the currents of world thought. And I find that very interesting. If you read his essays on Indian culture, if you read The Human Cycle, if you read a number of other works that he wrote during that period, he is engaging with the ideas and the movements that are going on in the world then. And again, I feel that somewhere it is our responsibility to look at what's happening around us, to see and make the effort to at least, I don't know, to apply that integral lens to the problems that we are facing today.
No, undoubtedly. I think that that's a really important point. On the one hand, there is the need to create new theories for receiving his language, but there's also the need to build the bridges that will connect his thought to what is going on right now, not only in terms of world events, but world currents, ideas, the world of ideas. Because I think that's one of the reasons why over time he has fallen off the map, so to say, which is that in the world of ideas, new names, new concepts, new theories come into existence. And if there's nobody to actually look at him in the light of those theories, or look at those theories in the light of his teachings, it becomes excluded. You see, it's excluded because nobody's looking at it. So I on the other hand, when one says, oh, this is only early 20th century work at the turn of the century, the interesting thing is that all the most important ideas that are relevant to us today were being generated at that time. This is what people don't realize about topicality and history. The history of our age, as it were, was really being revolutionized at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And Sri Aurobindo is an important, really powerfully important thinker in that milieu. So it's really in fact, if one looks at the theories and concepts that are being generated in our times, to a large extent, they're even more relevant if we put them side by side with Sri Aurobindo. Important for people to read his works.
And as we approach the end of our session, I just want to say that that's the importance or value of places like CIIS. where we are engaging with these ideas and we are contextualizing them in the context of the present world. And if you look back in the early 1950s, the mother had this vision and dream of having a university in Pondicherry, which she says the school would be a kernel for the university. And her whole idea of the university was a place where precisely this would happen. For various reasons, that university project couldn't manifest in its fullness. Some people say that it is, Auroville is the living university in a certain sense, and I believe there is some truth to that. But my point is, really read Sri Aurobindo, but also to embody, to practice, and engage with the world from that perspective.
And there is one more topic which I wanted to also to bring with this: how to read Sri Aurobindo. How? I think Sri Aurobindo gave us very interesting kind of clarity on approaches to knowledge. So when he writes The Human Cycle or The Ideal of Human Unity, you can learn the sociological and historical approach, and he's to the letter. He's perfectly psychologically following one thread. So I would rather read him not what he says, but how he does it. Embody it into myself, feel how it is, how the thought generated before he arrives at certain conclusions. Rather what he wants to say and how he wants to say it than what he says. Because what he says is important, definitely, but more important is his consciousness generating the knowledge. The same Life Divine, this is the philosophical approach. If you want to learn philosophical approach, there is no better book. Synthesis, psychological approach, and you can take these approaches one by one, and you will learn the whole way of living and understanding the world.
Quite true. I think you're talking about methodology, and I think there is a consistent academic methodology that is also a spiritual methodology that he's, and I completely agree that that's the way we have to look at Sri Aurobindo. Bring attention to, I'll defer to both of you because I'm not remembering exactly the terms he used, but in the Alipur jail, when he was spending his year in internment there and having the major part of his experiences, as he says, the rest of his work was already given to him in the jail. He talks about the Adesh in the jail. This term is used even in the Record of Yoga a number of times, the Adesh in the jail. And the Adesh in the jail has got something to do with the 4 lines of work that he will pursue once he gets out of the jail. Do you recollect what those were?
No, and it's the Record of Yoga is one of the texts that I have really not gone very deep into.
Yeah.
We got Richard to write on the Record of Yoga. He's probably the authority on that text.
Yeah.
What do you mean by 4 lines?
Yeah, it's there in the
Uttar speech, yes?
No. In the Record of Yoga, yeah, he talks about the Adesh in the jail. He uses that phrase a few times, and in 1 or 2 places he explains it, and he's got 4 terms for it. He says he was given the Adesh in the jail that after he comes out, these are the lines of his work. And he's got Sanskrit words for it, but I'll tell you what some of them I remember. One is yoga. That is the integral yoga. That's his primary work. The second one is the interpretation of the past, and he has a word for it. And third one is sahitya, which is literature, which is writing, introducing the new word. And the fourth one is samaja, that is creating a new society.
Actually, it is in his the foundations of the Indian culture. Also, he mentions exactly this: the recovery of the ancient spiritual knowledge to all its degree and richness and variety, and then applying it to new forms of knowledge with this recovery, and then finally creating new society.
Right.
This is, he gives one by one of these.
This is, he claims he was given this in the jail as an adesh of what he's going to do in future.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to some extent, even when we talk about his works, you can look at them like that, you know, his texts are of these kinds, you know, yoga, whether we talk about darshana as well, right? Of yoga, the letters on yoga, but then you also have the interpretations of the past, you know, the Veda, the Upanishad, the Gita. In a way, he's a bhashyakar in the almost in the Shankara, in the Vedantic sense. And then he does the works on Sahitya, you know, his own poetry, and also the interpretations of culture, and finally, you know, the creation of the groundwork for a new society, Samaj.
So this is a
I think we'll open it to questions. Yes.
yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic conversation, and but we should open it to conversations. We're going to invite people from online, our attendees, to submit questions, and otherwise we open it to the floor.
Yeah, thank you. That was absolutely illuminating and very interesting. My question is this: in terms of the archives, are there any correspondence or writings or letters that would be sort of off limits or not publishable from Sri Aurobindo or the mother? And the second question would be, what is being worked on or anticipated as the next publication from the archives?
Yeah. So I don't work in the ashram archives, but from what I understand, right from the 1940s and 50s, being put together, actually even earlier, from the early 30s, the earliest relations of letters, how those letters should be published, like removing all kinds of references to the persons that they were being written to. And by and large, if you see the early compilations of letters on yoga, they have that kind of approach, which has sort of built over time. So I think that the broadly, the archives continues to follow that. In some cases, there are exceptions, like correspondences which are with a particular person, where there is a sense of a chronological development, like Nirod Baran's correspondence with Sri Aurobindo. That if you remove the sort of counter, back and forth which is happening, the letters sort of lose their value in some sense. So I'm sure there is unpublished material, especially truly personal matters of a sadhak, and which are not of interest to a general readership. So that would be there. The second thing is your second question about what is coming up. I think the focus now is on publishing the letters that are being that are still unpublished from the mother, because there are still people sending in correspondence that their parents or grandparents have had, and those are still still unpublished. And over the last couple of years, 2 new volumes have come out, new correspondences have come out, and I think a third or even a fourth one is expected. I'm not sure about the fourth one, but there is certainly another volume expected. Yeah.
This is actually very interesting. the people who've claimed to have met the mother or with her, like Jean Gebser himself met the mother. He also claims to have corresponded with her.
Oh, interesting.
But
I didn't know that.
there's no record of it in the archives. Swami Lakshmanju, right, claims to have met the mother and corresponded with her. Now, of course, these claims are not being made by them necessarily, but by disciples. But there is somebody who's writing someone close to him, who's writing a biography, who actually he directly asks Swami Lakshmanju whether he felt in his knowledge anybody had completely realized the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism. And he said 3 people: Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, to meet the mother and had some correspondence with her. So this Pondicherry to the archives to see if he could find the correspondence. He couldn't find any correspondence. So it's a question, as you said, whether there is, or whether it's lost, or whether it's there, or whether the names are not known. So there is work to be done there.
There's also a lot of work to be done with specific disciples who play a significant or symbolic role. There are many such people who, like Haridas Chaudhary, for example, around his life and work. Another person that I've been looking into is this Chinese scholar, artist, yogi, Shu Fancheng, or Hushu as we call him in the ashram, who has an absolutely extraordinary journey and a role that he plays in translating Sri Aurobindo, some of Mother's text. And so there are all these other sort of secondary, I don't know how to put it. Secondary in the sense of this mother and Sri Aurobindo, and then you have their disciples who have also very interesting lives and approaches which can be looked into. So in terms of scholarship, I feel like there is it's just waiting to be tapped into.
What I was always fascinated with the role of the mother in the writings of Sri Aurobindo, because when she came in first time in 1914, he started writing his aria. And then she left till 1920 and she came back. He stopped writing his aria. This is something, I think she initiated this process. And somebody even of disciples asked him whether he was ever sitting on the path, not moving. Yeah? And he said that was the period of writing. All his works are written sitting on the path, waiting for the mother to come back. And from that time on, he was writing occasionally letters, some articles in 30s.
Revising the works. Yeah.
Amazing. The role of the mother, we never acknowledge, but it is she who initiated his writings.
Yeah. You want to take any questions online?
Let's do that. Yeah. And then we can come to you, Robert.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see somebody. Oh.
Well, okay, well, we have somebody online, so let's include the online right now. So John Robert is asking, would one or more of you develop more about Sri Aurobindo's ideas and intentions about a new language, perhaps suitable for the subjective age and beyond? And I guess I just will fold my own little question in as well, because this came up last night, the idea that Sri Aurobindo wrote a lot of prose, philosophical, psychological prose, before transitioning and focusing in future poetry. In this new language, John Roberts is bringing up that kind of a binary where the language of the mind through prose is secondary to the darshanic language, the language of ideas. So anyway, that was how I would fold that in.
I don't think Sri Aurobindo makes a binary between prose and poetry. And also, I don't think he wrote prose first and then poetry. He was a poet from the very beginning. And the future poetry is being written at the same time as the Life Divine and the Synthesis of Yoga are being written. And I'd say the Life Divine and the Synthesis of Yoga are as darshanik as Savitri. But in the intensity that a certain kind of language use affords. So we have propositional language, for example, which is following the logic of the mind and is directly addressed to the mind. And so that explains things, so to say. So that's the kind of prose that we are talking about, which falls at the level of, Sri Aurobindo in his theory of language sometimes evokes Kashmir Shaivism. Or at that point, he talks about it as tantric theory of language, which is the four stations of Paravak, Pashyanti Vak, Madhyama Vak, and Vaikhari Vak. So this propositional language is more like Vaikhari Vak. You see, so it is directly aimed at explaining things, while, a language that is coming close to direct transmission is challenging the syntactical structure of propositional logic. In fact, if you think about Upanishadic language, and if you think about contemporary philosophy, particularly continental philosophy, that is going back to pre-Socratic Greek language, there is a recognition of this fact, of the need to use language in a way that challenges propositional logic, and in a sense is in that way poetic. So, I mean, a lot of philosophy today is really poetry, and I think you can see that he's doing all these. And like Devdip was saying, there are different audiences to whom he's writing his different works. But there is a darshanic quality throughout, because his use of language has got this quality, this awareness that he's bringing to the, he puts a lot of emphasis on sound, on listening to the rhythms and the sound. But there's also the image, the imagery that he's using, the evocative. And it's interesting that he wrote in Sanskrit as well, but he wrote mostly in English. And he's making a case for the English as a mantric language. In the future poetry, he's making that case. That's what the whole history of poetry leading to the future is for him in that text. So he's modernizing the notion of mantra. And he's saying that in any language, if you connect it to its roots, spiritual roots of Aryan speech, for example, it retains that. So, but that can be brought into any language. And that's part of his theory of the opening up a new kind of non-propositional or non-objectified language of the future.
I want to just add that, I just remembered what the mother says, that when Sri Aurobindo was working on the Arya, she describes him sitting at the typewriter and typing continuously, almost as if it was just a kind of direct transmission of knowledge. It was not like a composed, worked upon in that sense writing, which went back and forth. It was simply sitting and write, like
is bypassing the mind completely. The words just coming into the head. Musician plays.
Created, he speaks about this, that Savitri was for him the means to reach higher and higher forms of expression. So he was bringing down higher levels of consciousness into the word and rewriting the whole passage again and again, because he felt that it does not express that consciousness. There is a mystery here, because the same phrase can be said by anyone. The same line, it was the hour before the gods awake, you can say it. But it seems when he does it, it is charged with consciousness. And when we read this phrase now, it has And if I was of charging word with consciousness, which we really.
So we're going to transition to the next panel in a couple of minutes. And so we'll take Robert's question.
Just to get a sense of the time. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, we'll take Robert's question and we'll
Please.
move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a question, but I have many, many thoughts because three people who know Sri Aurobindo so deeply can only stimulate my own thinking sort of parallel or by implication. Going way, way, way back to the beginning, subjective, objective, I'd like to suggest a third modality is, of course, terribly difficult and doesn't necessarily bridge. Subjective can be ineffective because it's about, well, that person's idea is not my person's idea. And so I think that perhaps another book or just a new ideal would be an emphasis on the dialogical or teaching quality. That is to say, I mean, if there were a book called Teaching Sri Aurobindo, it would be saying subjectively, this is what I have learned. Objectively, this is what Sri Aurobindo said. And now, following Debashish's observation that we are living in a mentality created by intellect, by modernity, then we have to take account and we have to say to the reader or the audience, this is the way all of us think. However, we can make another step. Start with reading Debashish or reading Sri Aurobindo, but then keep going because eventually you want to get to mantric thinking and mantric reading and mantric writing. So I see it as a hierarchy of at least 3 or 4 different levels and 3 or 4 stages. So I'm not sure I would have, I didn't actually take this in with respect to Sri Aurobindo, but after teaching and writing about Rudolf Steiner, I noticed the exact same phenomenon. People say, oh, I read your writing, but I can't read Rudolf Steiner. That's because Rudolf Steiner is doing what Sri Aurobindo is doing. So is Teilhard. And to some extent, even ordinary, I shouldn't call them ordinary, even philosophers not known as spiritual say, people don't want to read Whitehead, they want to read Matt Siegel, you know, or John or whatever. And yet they need to be reached. So we've got our work.
So he's talking about, just like you're saying, normally subjective means my personal reading or my personal understanding. But there is a universal subjective. In other words, the subjective can touch the universal in an individual way. So, at that. But what you're saying is also very well taken and very important, which is that even when one is doing that, or while one is doing that, the need for the dialogic, right? That I think in his hermeneutics, though, he is doing that, because if you look at his works, he's looking at the Veda, he's looking at the Upanishads, he's looking at other thought at that time. He's also looking at other thinkers of his time, and he is conducting a dialogue. But I think he's also exercising his intuition to evoke a consistency of understanding, you know. So I think there's a place for, particularly in our times and given who we are, the dialogic as a modality for deeper our access.
by the way, we're using a linguistic kind of framework. It's quite interesting. Subjective is the first person. Yeah? I will speak from myself, what I feel. Yeah, it could be very different. You're in different context. You don't feel the same way. The third person is objective knowledge, projected, already embodied in the word. You can, through this, to come to your own feelings. And the second person inquiry method is exactly dialogical. So first, second, and third, all of them have to be present. And then there will be fullness. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Robert.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Devdip. Debashish, Vladimir.